Just transfer it today, Daniel. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. My mother's voice was calm. It was too calm. I stared at the phone pressed against my ear, my eyes drifting to the folder sitting open on my desk. The white paper seemed to glow under my office lamp, revealing numbers that had been haunting me for weeks. I thought we agreed, she continued. Your sister needs it more. She is going through a hard time with the new business venture, and you have always been the stable one. I let the silence stretch just long enough to feel the tension vibrating through the line. I could picture her sitting in her high-back chair, probably sipping tea, while she decided my financial future for me. Then I said quietly, of course. I'll take care of it. Another pause followed. Then I heard it, relief. I could hear it in her quick intake of breath, and the way her voice softened instantly. That was the moment I knew something was very wrong. Because my mother never sounded relieved when it came to me. Usually, my existence was just a series of chores for her to manage, but this sounded like a woman who had just escaped a trap. Later that evening, I stood in her kitchen watching her laugh with my sister, Clara. The room was filled with the scent of expensive wine and roasted chicken. There was soft jazz playing in the background, creating an atmosphere of peace that felt entirely fake to me. They were clinking wine glasses and sharing a joke about a neighbor. It was that familiar warmth she never gave me, a golden light that seemed to shine only on Clara. You've always been the responsible one, my mother said, finally glancing at me as I stood near the door. You understand sacrifice. You know that family has to stick together to survive the storms. Clara didn't even look up from her phone. She just smirked at a text message and took a long sip of her drink. I smiled back at my mother, a mask I had worn since I was a child. But something didn't add up. The way she kept checking her watch and the way she avoided looking at my eyes for more than a second told me everything. Because this wasn't the first time she had asked me to save Clara. And this time it felt planned. It felt like a performance for an audience of one. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the reliable one. I am the person who shows up on time, pays the bills, and remembers everyone's birthday. I've been the one who fixes problems, the one who gives until there is nothing left. My sister, Clara, is completely different. She's impulsive, emotional, and charming in a way I've never been. She can walk into a room and make everyone forget her mistakes just by flashing a smile. And my mother has always chosen her. If there was one piece of cake left, it was for Clara. If there was a choice between my graduation and Clara's shopping trip, Clara won. I accepted that reality years ago because fighting it only made me feel small. What I didn't accept, what I couldn't ignore, was the pattern that started forming after my father died. He was the one who kept the balance in our home. After he passed away from a sudden heart attack 3 years ago, the house grew cold. Things stopped being about emotional favoritism. They started becoming purely financial. It was as if my mother saw my bank account as her personal safety net. It began with small things that seemed harmless at the time. My mother would call me on a Tuesday morning and say, "Can you cover Clara's rent just this once?" She had a problem with her bank. Then it became, "Can you co-sign a loan for her new car? She just needs a little help to get her credit score up." At first, it felt normal to me. My father always told me that family helps family, and I wanted to honor his memory by being the man he raised me to be. But then I noticed something changing in the way they treated me. The amounts of money they asked for began to increase rapidly. The urgency in their voices grew sharper, sounding more like a demand than a request. And the explanations for why Clara needed the money became less clear and more confusing. She was always starting a new business that never launched or buying equipment that never arrived. That's when I started keeping records. I didn't tell them, of course. I just quietly started a spreadsheet on my laptop. I saved every text, every receipt, and every bank transfer. I didn't know why I was doing it yet, but my gut told me to be ready. 3 months ago, I visited my mother's house while she was out running errands. I still had a key, and I wanted to drop off some groceries I had bought for her. I wasn't snooping when I arrived. At least, that's what I told myself as I walked through the quiet hallways of my childhood home. But when I walked past her study, I noticed something strange that stopped me in my tracks. The bottom drawer of her desk was slightly open. My mother is a very meticulous woman who prides herself on order and neatness. She never leaves things like that. Everything in her life usually has a specific place, and an open drawer was like a loud scream in a library. I looked toward the front door, knowing I had about 20 minutes before she returned. My heart started to beat a little faster against my ribs. I felt a strange chill in the room, even though the heater was on. I walked into the study and stood over the desk. I knew that if I opened that drawer, I might find something that would change my life forever. I took a deep breath, reached down, and pulled the drawer open the rest of the way. Inside that drawer, I found a thick blue folder. It was hidden beneath some old tax papers and magazines, but it was clearly the most important thing in there. It was neatly labeled with a small white sticker. On that sticker was my name, Daniel. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling slightly. I felt like a thief in my own mother's house, but the curiosity was a fire I couldn't put out. I opened the folder and began to flip through the pages. At first, I saw things I expected, copies of my birth certificate and school records. But as I got deeper into the stack, the documents changed. They weren't old records anymore. They were fresh, crisp papers dated within the last 6 months. They were legal forms from banks and investment firms that I had never seen before. My eyes scanned the lines of text, and my breathing became shallow. There were letters from lawyers and descriptions of my personal assets, including the house my father had left to me. What I saw changed everything I thought I knew about my family. It wasn't just a folder about my life. It was a roadmap of my wealth. My mother wasn't just keeping track of me. She was watching my money like a predator. There was a specific document inside the folder that made me stop breathing for a second. It was a financial authorization form. This form gave someone the power to move money out of my primary savings account and authorize large asset transfers without my verbal consent. I stared at the bottom of the page. There it was, my signature. It was right there on the line, clear as day, except for one huge problem. I never signed it. I remembered that day clearly because the document was dated for a time when I was away on a business trip in Vancouver. My chest tightened as if a giant hand was squeezing the air out of my lungs. I looked closer at the ink. The handwriting was close. It was very, very close to how I write my own name. The loops of the letters and the way the D slanted were almost perfect. But I knew my own hand. I knew that I never used that specific type of pen, and the pressure on the paper was different. This was a forgery. And that's when I realized something that made my hands go cold. This wasn't just a mother liking one child more than the other. This wasn't favoritism. This was a cold, calculated preparation for a robbery. I didn't confront her that day. I heard her car pull into the driveway, and I quickly closed the drawer and walked back to the kitchen. I pretended to be busy putting the milk away in the fridge. When she walked in and smiled at me, I smiled back. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't mention the folder or the signature. Instead, I went home to my apartment and sat in the dark for hours. When I finally moved, I opened my laptop and started digging deeper than I ever had before. I spent the entire night going through my bank statements, old emails, and transaction histories. I looked at the small favors I had done for Clara over the last year, and then I saw the truth. It wasn't just the money I knew about. There were small transfers happening every few weeks that I had missed because they were under $50. They were repeated over and over again. These were being sent from accounts connected to me into accounts linked to Clara. It was a slow bleed, designed so I wouldn't notice. But as I followed the trail of money, I found something even worse than the small thefts. One specific transaction led me to a business account I had never seen. It was for a registered company called Whitmore Logistics and Management. I had never heard of it, even though it used our family name. I spent the next 2 days researching this company using every tool I had as a professional analyst. When I finally checked the legal ownership of the company, I expected to see my mother's name. But it wasn't there. Clara's name wasn't there either. Instead, the company was listed under proxy, a lawyer I had never met who worked in a different city. This company was a shell. It didn't have any employees or an office. It only existed to hold assets. That's when I realized the full scope of the betrayal. They weren't just taking my cash to pay for Clara's lifestyle. They were moving my future into a dark room where I couldn't reach it. They were hiding something much bigger than a few $1,000s. They were building a cage for my inheritance, and they were using my own forged signature to lock the door. I felt a mix of hot anger and cold clarity. I wasn't just a son anymore. I was a target. And then came the call that started this whole story. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. My mother didn't ask how my day was. She didn't ask about my health. She just said, "Transfer everything, Daniel. Move the remaining balance from the trust into the management account we talked about." It wasn't a request this time. It was a demand, though she tried to disguise it as motherly concern for the family's long-term security. She told me that the market was crashing and that this was the only way to protect what Dad had left us. She spoke quickly, her words tripping over each other, trying to create a sense of panic in me. That's when it finally clicked. This wasn't about helping Clara get her life together. This wasn't a temporary fix for a struggling sister. This was the final step in their plan. They had the forged documents ready, but they needed one last voluntary move from me to make it all look legal and clean in court. They wanted me to hand them the keys to my own life while they patted me on the back and called me the responsible one. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I didn't say no. In fact, I made sure to sound a little bit worried and unsure, just to play the part they expected of me. "Are you sure this is the best move, Mom?" I asked, keeping my voice soft. She jumped on my hesitation immediately, giving me a dozen reasons why I had to trust her. I listened to her lies for 10 minutes, and then I finally said, "Okay, I'll do it." I said yes, and that was the most important decision I made in this entire mess. Because saying no would have ended it right then and there. If I had shouted at her or accused her of forgery, she would have destroyed the evidence and found a different way to hurt me. But saying yes gave me the most valuable thing in the world. It gave me time. It made them feel safe. It made them think that their reliable Daniel was still the same person he had always been, a man who would do anything to please his mother. While they were celebrating their victory, I was starting my own game. They thought I was the prey, but I was about to become the hunter. I contacted my lawyer the next morning before the sun was even up. His name is Marcus, and he has been a friend of mine since college. I also called my accountant, a woman who is famous for her ability to find a single missing penny in $1 million budget. I didn't start by accusing my mother or sister of anything. I've learned that in the professional world, you let the facts do the talking. I just asked them questions. I asked them to look into the Whitmore Logistics company and to verify the signatures on my recent bank authorizations. I gave them specific dates and account numbers to track. We spent hours in a small office with the blinds closed, drinking cold coffee and looking at digital screens. What we found was much worse than I had even expected in my darkest moments. It wasn't just a simple case of a sister stealing from a brother. It was a deep, organized web of lies that had been growing for years, reaching into accounts I hadn't looked at since my father's funeral. My mother hadn't just started this recently. She had been waiting for the right moment since the day the will was read. As Marcus and my accountant dug deeper, the truth became undeniable. There wasn't just one forged document in that blue folder. There were 3 separate ones. Each one was more aggressive than the last. The first gave Clara access to my secondary savings. The second allowed her to use my name for business credit. And the third, the most dangerous one, was a full power of attorney form that had been filed but not yet activated. Each one was increasing Clara's access to my assets, while slowly removing my ability to stop her. Each one was signed with a perfect copy of my signature, except none of them were real. I felt a deep sense of nausea as I looked at the dates. That's when I realized that this had been happening for months. Every time I sat at the dinner table with them, every time I helped Clara move her furniture, and every time I bought my mother a gift, they were laughing at me behind my back. They saw my kindness as a weakness to be exploited. They didn't see a son or a brother. They saw a bank account that needed to be drained. My father's will was a very complex document. He was a man who worked hard for his money, and he wanted to make sure it was used wisely. He had left the majority of the estate to me, because he knew Clara wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. But there was a clause in the will that I had almost forgotten about. It was a voluntary transfer clause. It stated that if I voluntarily transferred control of my assets to a family-owned management company, those assets could legally be reassigned to other family members without any legal dispute or probate. That's what they were trying to trigger with their constant pressure. They didn't want to use force because force can be fought in court. They wanted consent. They wanted me to sign that final transfer so that all of my father's hard work would legally become Clara's property. Once I signed that paper, I would have no way to get it back. They were trying to use my own love for my father's legacy to take that legacy away from me. It was a brilliant plan, but they made one mistake. They forgot that I am my father's son. There's something you need to understand about why I fought so hard. I don't care about the money. I've worked hard in my own career, and I can take care of myself. I don't need a massive inheritance to be happy. Not really. What I cared about more than anything in the world was the house. It is a beautiful old home on the edge of town, the one my father built with his own 2 hands when I was a baby. It is the place where every memory I have of him still lives. I can still see him in the garden, and I can still hear his voice in the library. My mother and Clara wanted to sell it to a developer to fund their logistics shell company. They saw it as just another asset to be flipped for a profit. But to me, it was a museum of my life. It was the only thing I had left of the man who truly loved me. And they were about to take it. They were going to tear down the walls my father built just to buy more designer bags and expensive wine. That was the line they shouldn't have crossed. That was the moment my sadness turned into iron. I scheduled the final transfer for a Friday morning. I made sure to send an email to my mother and Clara, telling them that everything was ready. I told them I was nervous, but that I trusted their judgment. My mother insisted that we do the final signing in person at her house, just to make it official and celebrate as a family, she said over the phone. I could hear the excitement in her voice, a predatory hunger she couldn't quite hide anymore. Of course, she wanted to do it in person. She wanted to see me sign my life away. She wanted to have witnesses there, a notary and a lawyer, so that I could never claim I was pressured or confused. She wanted the victory to be total. I agreed to everything. I told her I would bring all the necessary folders and documents. I told her I would bring a bottle of champagne to celebrate our new beginning. She laughed and called me her wonderful son. I hung up the phone and looked at the folder my own lawyer had prepared. It was time for the show to begin. The Friday morning was cold and gray. I drove to my mother's house with a heavy folder on the passenger seat. When I walked inside, the atmosphere was thick with fake happiness. We sat at the long mahogany dining table, the same table where we used to have family dinners when my father was alive. My mother sat at the head of the table, looking regal and proud. Clara was sitting next to her, smiling at me with a look of fake pity. They had brought a notary and a lawyer I didn't recognize. "Are you sure about this, Daniel?" the lawyer asked, sliding the final transfer papers toward me. He looked bored, like this was just another routine meeting. I looked at my mother. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on the pen in my hand. "It's for the best, honey," she whispered. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." I picked up the pen and held it over the signature line. For a second, the room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. But that, yes, wasn't the truth. It was the last lie I would ever tell them. As the documents were placed in front of me, I didn't sign them. Instead, I reached into my bag and slid another folder onto the table. It was a bright red folder, a sharp contrast to the white papers already there. My mother frowned, her eyebrows knitting together in confusion. She reached out a hand as if to touch it, then pulled back. "What's that?" she asked, her voice losing its sweetness. I looked her directly in the eyes. For the first time in years, I didn't look away. I didn't blink. "That's what I was going to ask you," I said calmly. I opened the red folder and began to lay out the pages one by one across the mahogany surface. I laid them out like a deck of cards, each one a piece of evidence. I watched her face as she saw the copies of the forged signatures. I watched her eyes widen as she saw the bank statements from the shell company. I watched Clara's face turn from a smile to a mask of pure terror. The silence in the room changed. It was no longer a silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. Inside that red folder were perfect copies of everything I had found. I had the forged signatures from the blue folder in her desk. I had the transaction history of every small theft from my savings account. I had the legal registration of the shell account and the name of the proxy lawyer she had used. I also had a sworn statement from my own handwriting expert, proving that the signatures were fake. Clara's smile disappeared first, her face turning a sickly shade of white. She looked like she was going to be sick right there on the table. Then my mother's expression changed. The regal mask crumbled, replaced by a look of cold, sharp anger. She looked at me not as a son, but as an enemy who had outsmarted her. She didn't try to deny it. She didn't cry. She just sat there, frozen. And for the first time in my life, she didn't have anything to say. The woman who always had a reason, always had an excuse, and always had a demand was finally completely silent. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I didn't report it to the police yet, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. But I will if I have to. The notary and the lawyer she had brought looked at each other, realizing they were in the middle of a crime scene. The lawyer leaned forward, flipping through the pages of my red folder. His expression changed from boredom to professional concern. He realized that if he signed off on this now, he would lose his license or worse. "This is very serious," he said quietly, looking at my mother. "This is fraud and forgery on a massive scale." I leaned back in my chair and watched them. I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders that I had been carrying since I was a little boy. I wasn't the reliable victim anymore. I was the one in control. I had the evidence, I had the truth, and I had the power to change their lives the same way they had tried to change mine. My mother finally looked down at the table, her hands shaking slightly. The responsible son had finally stopped giving, and she didn't know how to handle it. Clara started talking first, her voice high and desperate. "Daniel, please, it's not what it looks like. We were just trying to grow the family business for everyone. We were going to tell you eventually." She started crying, big fat tears rolling down her face, but I had seen that performance too many times to believe it. It was just another tool in her box. But it was too late for tears. The documents on the table didn't care about her feelings. My mother still didn't speak. She just stared at me with a look of pure shock, like she was seeing me for the very first time. She had spent 34 years thinking I was a puppet she could control with a few kind words or a guilt trip. She had never considered that I might be smarter than her. She had never considered that the quiet son was actually the one paying the most attention. The room felt cold, and the fake warmth of the morning was gone forever. The family they tried to build on a foundation of lies was finally starting to collapse around them. "You wanted me to choose, Mom," I said, standing up from the table. I looked at the two women who were supposed to love me and protect me. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to earn a place in their hearts. I thought about my father and the house he loved. So I did. I made a choice. I pushed the original transfer papers back toward them, unsigned and useless. I'm choosing myself. I'm choosing my father's memory. And I'm choosing the truth. My mother finally looked up, her eyes wet, but her jaw set. "You'll destroy this family, Daniel," she whispered. I shook my head. "No, Mom. You destroyed this family the moment you picked up a pen and signed my name. I'm just the one cleaning up the mess." I picked up my red folder and tucked it under my arm. I didn't need their permission anymore. I didn't need their love. I had something much better. I had my freedom. I walked toward the door without looking back, leaving them sitting in the wreckage of their own greed. Legal action followed quickly. Once Marcus and my legal team presented the evidence to the bank's fraud department, the shell accounts were frozen within 48 hours. The Whitmore Logistics Company was shut down by the state. An official investigation was opened into the forgery. And while I didn't send my mother to jail, I made sure she could never touch a single cent of my money again. She had to sign a legal agreement that gave up all her rights to my father's estate in exchange for me not filing criminal charges. What they thought was a quiet, private theft became a very public embarrassment in our legal circles. People started asking questions, and the perfect reputation my mother had spent decades building started to crack. Clara had to move out of her expensive apartment and get a real job for the first time in her life. The money she had been siphoning away was gone, returned to the accounts where it belonged. They had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they were the ones who lost everything that mattered to them. I still have the house. I spent the last few months restoring it, fixing the garden just the way my father liked it. It is my sanctuary now, a museum of my life where I feel safe and at peace. My father's memory is intact, and his legacy is protected from those who would have sold it for a quick profit. Clara doesn't call me anymore. I heard she's telling everyone that I'm a cold-hearted monster who abandoned his family, but I don't care. Their opinions no longer have power over me. My mother tried to call me once, about a month ago. She left a voicemail saying she missed me and that families should forgive. I listened to the whole message. Then I deleted it without a word. I didn't answer because I realized that for her, forgiveness just meant going back to the way things were. She wanted her reliable son back so she could start the cycle again. But that Daniel is gone. He died the day he opened that drawer and found the truth. People often think that betrayal is a loud thing. They think it's about shouting matches and dramatic exits. But it isn't. Betrayal is quiet. It is careful. It is done in the dark by people who smile at you while they take from you. It is done by the people who call you family while they plan your loss. If there's one thing I have learned from this entire experience, it is this. Pay attention to the small things. Watch the drawers that are left open. Listen to the silences in a phone call. Because sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who have been counting your money since the day you were born. I stand at my father's window now and watch the sun set over the yard he loved. I am alone, but I am not lonely. I am at peace because I finally realized that my value doesn't come from what I can give to people who don't love me. It comes from being the man my father knew I could be. I am Daniel Whitmore, and I am finally the one in charge of my own story.